Welcome back to The Gaze. I am Henry Keane, and this is my show, Talk for More. In our previous episode, we talked about what the Western world should do to help Ukraine win the war. In this part, we would love to talk about more the sanctions and economics, how to do it. I'm happy to meet you on a digital platform of Future Europe, a space where we'll find and highlight all of the most significant events and talk with the best of experts about it. Experts of microchips and electronics of key importance needed by Russia for its military industry have returned to levels by 2022 as Russia has learned to better circumvent sanctions imposed against it. Jim O'Brien, US State Department Sanctions Coordinator, states that in an interview with Politico. According to the American official, European companies sell electronics to other countries, which in turn resell them back to Russia, and this supply channel is not yet taken into account by the sanctions. According to Mr. O'Brien, the US has identified 5 countries who help Russia circumvent Western sanctions, and they are Turkey, Kazakhstan, Georgia, the United Arab Emirates, and Armenia. As we can see, these countries did some of their political homework to get more and more distanced from the Kremlin. Still, it is long until the next package of sanctions to close the loopholes in them. Is that even possible to close all the loopholes? Do you know? What do you think? I'm sorry. Because more sanctions, more loopholes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's only possible with, I'm coming to a circular argument now, Henry, because it's only possible when people are willing to do the right thing and take a bit of the pain. This is none of supporting Ukraine is not free. You know, in the UK, every day we hear of problems with the cost of living and interest rates and mortgages and fuel is more expensive and everything else. And there are real problems. Again, I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm at the point in my life where I'm, insulated from this. But I said to somebody, I think it was about a year ago, I was writing an article or something, and I said, I went to the gas station today and I filled up my car and it cost me, prices had gone up by 50%, and I thought, I can't afford to do this. I can't afford to do that. That's what I did today. Do you know what I didn't do? I didn't take a phone call from a relative who told me that my son had been shot dead and his daughter and his children raped by Russian soldiers, to give one example. Or that, as somebody I know has lost 2 brothers in the Battle of Mariupol and a sister in another city because her apartment building was hit by a Russian missile. And this guy is flying fighter jets at the moment for the Ukrainian armed forces. I don't have to. So, the hardships that we put up with in the West are so insignificant. I don't know what the answer is. Apart from people like you and me, we write and we talk and we do interviews and we argue and we make the point. But we need to have, the Turkeys, the Georgias, the United Arab Emirates, the Armenians. We need to have more. We all need to have more empathy for what's going on in Ukraine. I'm coming right back to where this interview started. We need to have more empathy for the fact that that absolute genocide has been committed, and it's not acceptable if we want to live in a civilized world. And, it's not even about democracy. It's about something that's bigger than democracy. That's freedom.
Well,
there's freedom.
The feeling of freedom and empathy that you just mentioned, I think that this is a born-in thing. You either have it or not.
Yeah.
Please let me return to sanctions. New sanctions against Russia stuck in a limbo over the Greek-Hungarian protest. Hungary and Greece are not happy with a list of private companies Ukraine calls war sponsors, which includes a number of European ones. As Politico puts it, the EU is currently discussing its 11th sanction package against Russia after the start of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine more than a year ago. But Budapest and Athens have thrown a collective spanner in the works by linking their approval for the package to a separate thorny issue involving Ukraine. Kiev has compiled a list of private sponsors and companies of war sponsors, which includes a number of European companies. When we talk about Greek companies, we need to understand that in Greece, there are quite a large number of companies that are owners of tankers and ships as legal entities. These are companies in question. They provide transport services to the Russian Federation for the transportation of oil, in particular for the grey export of this energy carrier to the third countries. Therefore, due to the fact that they help circumvent sanctions, they were included in the list of war sponsors. Simple as that. So obviously what is happening, Hungary and Greece are using the sanctions package as a political leverage. Is there a possibility that they will be able to reach a reliable and workable agreement with Europe? And if that is the case, when that can happen, you think?
I'm sorry, Henry. I don't know I don't have the answer to that. I mean, this is back to the complexity of, getting 27 or 30, or 27 in the case of the European Union countries to agree on. The nature of the European Union is all 27 countries need to agree. So any one country can block a major movement. So it's, I'm not sufficiently an expert on the mechanics and the levers of power within the European Union to know what can be done by the overwhelming majority to convince, or whether there are any sanctions that can be brought to bear on Budapest and Athens that would make them relent on these activities. It is a challenge. I'm afraid I know what should be done, but I don't know how it can be done.
I will take this as an answer.
Union,
Thank you very much, Cormac. I will take this as an answer. Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister of Hungary, Zsolt Semyon, has confirmed the transfer of 11 Ukrainian prisoners of war of Hungarian origin from Russia to Hungary. According to the Hungarian outlet ATV, the Russian Orthodox Church issued a statement on June 8th. I quote, as part of an inter-church cooperation, at the request of the Hungarian side, a group of Ukrainian prisoners of war of Transcarpathian origin who took part in combat actions was transferred to Hungary. The release of Ukrainian prisoners of war is always good news, of course, wrote MFA Ukraine spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko. At the same time, the Ukrainian government was not informed about the relevant negotiations between the Hungarian and Russian parties. The Ukrainian side submitted a request to provide detailed information about our citizens and to immediately ensure access to them in order to get acquainted with the state of health and provide them with consular assistance. Ignoring the Ukrainian side is nothing but Moscow's attempt to twist the whole picture and to turn the fate of Ukrainian Transcarpathians into Hungarian inner matter and not that of Ukraine. Moscow is trying to strengthen its propaganda narrative, I believe, about the split of Ukraine and so-called territorial claims of Ukraine's neighbors on its territory. It's both sad and obvious that Hungary, again, played along with Putin's propaganda and became a core participant of the Russian disinformation tool IPSO, Info-Psychological Operation. It looks just like a human trafficking to me, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it not? Do you think Orban and Putin will ever be held accountable for that, or it will just, playing their roles and doing what they want? But do you think that Viktor Orban really believes it? Like what he's doing, he's opposing Ukraine in any possible way?
No, I think Viktor Orban is a case aside. Viktor Orban is an ally of the Kremlin, and certainly was going back to when I was working in Kyiv and when I was working with the Minister of Education and Science when the Hungarians were giving Ukraine huge problems because of a Ukrainian language act back in 2017, 2018. And of course, Hungary has a seat on NATO and a seat on the EU. So it has, and it continues to do everything it can to frustrate Ukraine's progress and to frustrate support for Ukraine. So I think, if I was to make a judgment, I would say Viktor Orban knows exactly what he is doing. And Viktor Orban, by all the evidence that we have, is an ally of the Kremlin.
Obviously, Viktor Orban has been bought, but would he be held accountable just as well as Putin for all they're doing?
Well, again, not an area of great expertise, but I go back to 2018 and work that I did with the then Minister for Education and Science when Ukraine was having initially huge problems, and again in the region of Transcarpathia, and the ethnic Hungarian minority there, and there was claims that they were going to lose their language rights and that they were going to have the Ukrainian language imposed on them. And it was very, very clear at the time that Orban was very much on Putin's side and on the Kremlin side, and was using this to gain advantage, but was also using Hungary's position and veto within the European Union and within NATO to block and to frustrate Ukrainian progress. So without being really all over the detail, I think on this what we see is a continuation of something which has been going on for, at least in my time, since late 2017, 2018, with this particular problem with Orban and Hungary. But I think the more important thing to notice is it would seem by all the evidence that Orban is clearly an ally of Putin and is not a friend of Ukraine and is not a good partner of the European Union or NATO, not a partner that the European Union or NATO can rely on. And this is a serious problem, and this is a question for the leadership of the European Union and the leadership of NATO. How do they solve a problem called Orban? Greece is a problem, but to a lesser extent.
Absolutely.
But I would focus on Hungary and Orban, who has, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe recently been successful. Have there been elections in Hungary recently?
Elections in Hungary, I can't remember the exact day, but I believe so. I don't think so. This is the case.
Yeah. Sorry, I may be getting confused, but I mean that to me is the overwhelming problem. That we have an enemy inside the camp. We have a partner in the EU and NATO that EU and NATO cannot depend upon, and that certainly
Obviously
Ukraine cannot depend on, but that Putin can depend on. Now that to me seems blatantly clear, and if nothing else, the good voters across 450 million people across the European Union need to be very, very clear in understanding this. And maybe that's something that, your channel can help do, because their leaders must know that their people do not support this. But it's a huge problem, and how that problem is solved is a question for, as I said, for the leaders of the EU and for the leaders of NATO. But it's a massive problem at a time of war. And a war that I keep saying, the point is, this war is not just being waged on Ukraine. This is a war against all of us. And it's a war that began being waged against all of us at least as early as 2005. I go back to 2005 when two things happened. One, Russia Today was set up, but also Viktor Yushchenko. The Russians tried to assassinate Viktor Yushchenko, the president of the Orange Revolution, who had very clearly put his hand up that he intended to take Europe on the westward direction that the Ukrainian people wanted. So they tried to kill him. They put dioxin in the borscht. I know quite a little bit about this because I've met the Yushchenkos and I know a number of friends of theirs. And Victor's wife said to me at the start of this war, she said, Cormac, the first shot in this war was fired when they tried to murder my husband. And we did nothing about it. We didn't even pay attention to it. There was a prospective, he was a prospective president at the time. He wasn't even president, he was campaigning to the Orange Revolution to be president. And it was very clear that Viktor Yushchenko would do everything in his power to take Ukraine westward. So Russia tried to kill him. That should have been a very early signal. At the same time as they were setting up Russia Today.
Thank you very much for your answer and for your position again and again. Can I ask you a personal question?
Absolutely.
Are you a jealous person?
Am I jealous?
Yes.
No.
All right,
I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Then I would love to ask a question to another expert. Is that okay with you?
Please.
All right. The idea of creating an artificial intelligence is no less exciting than a time machine concept. The only difference is that it looks like with AI we are on the brink. At least it feels like this. Maybe it is a brink of our survival as a humankind. We would need a time machine then to save humanity and all that Hollywood concept further. But today we have to talk for more with our Deus Ex Machina. ChatGPT is answering our question, which was, can sanctions against Russia affect the decisions of Putin and the Kremlin authorities? How exactly? Here's the answer. Sanctions can indeed have an impact on the decisions of Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin authorities, although the exact extent of the impact can vary depending on several factors. Here are some ways in which sanctions can influence their decision-making. Economic pressure. Sanctions often target key sectors of the Russian economy, such as energy, finance, and defense. By imposing restrictions on trade, investment, and access to international financial markets, sanctions can significantly harm Russia's economy and its ability to fund various projects and initiatives. This economic pressure can force the Kremlin to reassess its policies and priorities, especially if the sanctions create financial hardships for the country and its citizens. Political fallout. Sanctions can also lead to political consequences for the Russian leadership. If the economic situation deteriorates due to sanctions, public dissatisfaction may arise, potentially affecting Putin's domestic popularity and Kremlin standing. The authorities may face increased scrutiny and pressure to address the economic challenges, leading them to reevaluate their policies or engage in negotiations to alleviate the sanctions. International isolation. Sanctions can contribute to Russia's isolation on the international stage. As countries impose sanctions, it becomes more difficult for Russia to engage in diplomatic and economic relationship with the international community. This isolation can limit Russia's influence, reduce its access to important resources and technologies, and constrain its ability to achieve its geopolitical objectives. Response and adaptation. The Russian authorities can respond to sanctions in several ways. They may choose to retaliate with their own countermeasures, impose restrictions on foreign companies operating in Russia, or seek alternative economic partnerships with countries less inclined to enforce sanctions. Additionally, they may adapt these policies to mitigate the impact of sanctions, such as diversifying the economy or strengthening ties with non-Western partners. Nationalistic rallying. In some cases, sanctions can result in a nationalistic rallying effect, where the Russian population perceives the sanctions as unjust or aggressive actions against their country. These can lead to increased support for the government and a sense of solidarity among the population, thereby strengthening the resolve of Putin and the Kremlin authorities. It is important to note that the effectiveness of sanctions is influencing the decision-making of Putin and the Kremlin authorities is not guaranteed. Their responses can be unpredictable, and they often exhibit a high degree of resilience and determination in pursuing their objectives. Have you heard what ChatGPT just answered us? What do you think, Mr. Smith? Is that the reliable answer? Is ChatGPT a clever person?
Sorry?
Is Chad, I'm asking you, you just heard the answer to my question that ChatGPT just gave us. Do you think this is the reliable answer? Do you think this is the case? Do you think that sanctions are really can be working, like for example, can instigate the nationalistic rallying in Russia? Do you think it is possible for the nation to rise against Putin because ChatGPT thinks it is the case?
I think I've said already that sanctions need to be used to bring home the reality to the Russian people. One of the very cynical things which Dmytro Kuleba, somebody who I called a colleague for 2 years and I have a lot of respect for, quite rightly said was that, companies look to the money they are making, and this is one of the breaks on sanctions that we don't want to we don't want to hurt ourselves with sanctions too much, and large companies don't want to impose sanctions that are going to hurt them. There's a need for a realization of the seriousness of the fight that we are in, And if people realize that, we all need to take whatever pain we need to make sure that Russia is defeated. But I'll mention one sanction that's close to my own heart. The International Olympic Committee is currently being despicable, I would say, in insisting that Russian athletes will be allowed to compete at the forthcoming Olympics.
Outrageous.
That is absolutely, that should be absolutely out of the question. So many of these athletes, for a start, are, members of the Russian armed forces. And this is the sort of thing, when the Russian people and sport in Russia has always, from Soviet times, has been a huge factor to generate national pride and national focus. Russia should not have been allowed to host a Football World Cup in 2018. They certainly should not be allowed to go to the Olympics next year. And if that is the sort of thing I believe would really bring home to the Russian people the cost of the illegal war that they are waging now. Certainly, Putin and the Kremlin will use this to say that that this is a fight they are in against the West and against NATO, which they are already doing. But we are in this fight, and we're in it. We still haven't taken the gloves off, to use a sporting term. I really believe that we need to take the gloves off with Russia and do an awful lot more. We need to do more on sanctions. It's very interesting. I was wondering how large the Russian economy is. The Russian economy is smaller than the economy of Italy. If you put the economies of the European Union and, for the sake of argument, Britain, if you combine them, because up to recently Britain was in the EU, but also, more importantly, Britain is probably the strongest European supporter, the Baltics aside. But in terms of the amount of money and the weight that Britain has, Britain is the strongest supporter. So if you include Britain's economy and the EU economy, it's 20 times the size of the Russian economy. Why are we struggling to financially cripple this country?
Why?
Because we don't want to take the pain. Our big companies don't want to take the pain. Our citizens don't want to take the pain, and if their leaders impose that pain on them, they may vote their leaders out in the next election. I said before, democracy it's very imperfect, but it's the best system of government we have.
Thank you, Mr. Churchill.
You and I and many people listening to this certainly would not swap our imperfect democracies. And here in Britain, there is very much that's imperfect about our democracy at the moment that myself and many other people are not happy with. But I wouldn't swap living in this country, Great Britain, for one moment to live somewhere like China or Russia or North Korea or Iran or Belarus, unfortunately, at the moment, where the great Belarusian people, I think one of the reasons that Lukashenko has never actually got involved, I don't think his people would allow him. I'm not even sure his armed forces would allow him, because there is a great struggle for democracy and freedom and human rights going on in Belarus at the moment. Very, very similar. I think there's a lot of similar characteristics, Belarusian people and the Ukrainian people, but unfortunately they are in the grip of a unreconstructed Soviet dictator. We don't want to take the pain. We don't want to take the risk.
Nothing to
we want to do
it.
We want to do it safe. We want to do it safely. And as I said, I've got to be careful what I say, because I'm sitting here in a very comfortable home and I'm not out at the front. But I do what I can. But I think all of us need to look into our own souls and ask ourselves the question, what are we willing to do? What price are we willing to pay to support Ukraine and to make sure that...
I'm sorry, yeah, please continue. Yeah, I've been very close to the front line. I've been in Kharkiv, in Odessa, I've been in Bucha, I've been, in many places in Ukraine, and I could have been sitting in Berlin. I could have been doing business with my brother, but I'm not. And I can tell you that taking the pain, if you want to take the pain, come over to Ukraine. Just look at what is going on. Don't go to the front line. No, don't. Just live in Kyiv for a month, where air raid alerts blare in the air like every night. Live like that for a month. Live without power, without electricity, without water. And you can survive. I mean, you can even get to choose your wine in restaurants sometimes when they're open. This is a fact that I know. But let us please get back to more economical questions. Reconstruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant will last for 5 years and will cost up $1-2 billion. It was stated by the General Director of Ukrhydroenergo, Igor Sirota. It is next to impossible for us, the country at war, to find these resources for itself. What could be the proper communication strategy to reach the goal, to get the international funds for that?
Well, there is already very significant international support for Ukraine. And as brave and resilient as the Ukrainian people are, if it was not for the international support, and I must mention, my country, the country I have lived in for 36 years, Britain has been at the forefront of giving that support, along with the United States, but obviously all three Baltic nations have been fantastic supporters of Ukraine, as has Poland and other European nations. But again, I think the Western countries must now double down and do even more to support Ukraine, both in reconstruction, but before that also to give Ukraine more support in armaments to enable Ukraine to drive Russia off their land. There is more that the West must do, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. But my question was, do you have any specific communication tool that might be used to deliver a message that it needs to be done right away? Because in terms of, that would be my next question, but please answer that. Is that some specific communication tool to deliver the message quick and efficiently?
I'm not sure that there is any tool other than the tools that are already being used. Right. The Ukrainian government, the government communication coming out of Ukraine over the last 16 months, and I am a government communication expert, has been world-class. The world, I think, can learn a huge amount about how Ukraine has communicated from Volodymyr Zelensky down. And I think we need to just all work harder to get Ukraine's message across. But of course, this is not helped by Russian disinformation, which far too many people in the West are susceptible to. And an example of this I think you would like to discuss is how far too many media channels in the West have been reporting both sides blame each other for this. And in fact, I was made so angry when Jeremy Bowen, who is the international editor of the BBC, formerly the greatest, broadcasting corporation on the face of the earth, said in a late night news program, we may never definitively know who blew up the dam. He went on to give 3 options. 1, it was Russia. 2, it could have been Ukraine. 3, the dam could simply have collapsed. This was absolutely appalling. This will have, Mr. Bowen will have delighted Putin and his thugs in the Kremlin with those words. This is very unhelpful. So, starting with the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, and, people like me, I do my very, very small bit to try and communicate on behalf of Ukraine and to advocate for Ukraine and to be on Ukraine's side. Truthfully, we must all work very, very hard to get the truth across and to counter the great Russian lies, which Russia has spent an awful lot of money since probably 2005 in spreading these toxic lies across the world.
Well, believe me, Cormac, can I call you Cormac?
Please.
Yes, believe me, your effort is what matters. Because I hear the questions all the time. I am from Latvia. I was born in Riga. So I hear the questions like, why should we be helping Ukraine? I mean, but there are human values. And all over the human universe, they are present. And whether if you not stand for these values, whatever the problem is, if it's in Ukraine or UK or Latvia, then you should be just thrown out of this human universe. This is exactly what is happening with Russia right now. So your efforts...
Henry, may I say something on this? You posed the question, why should we in the West help Ukraine? There are two very simple reasons, and I have been saying this for nearly since January 2022. The first is, and I predicted this unfortunately, but since the further invasion, Russia has been carrying out genocide in Ukraine. That is genocide that passes all 5 tests of the United Nations Charter on Genocide. This is genocide of a peaceful, democratic people in 2023. This simply on a humanitarian level, we cannot allow that to exist. That is the first reason. It is a clear cause of decency why we must support Ukraine. But there is a second reason. And everybody in the West is not as committed as I am. I fell in love with Ukraine and Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian people literally in my first few days in 2016 when I went over as a British diplomat to work with the Ukrainian government. But even if we don't care, this is a wolf which will come to our door. The big threat here is to the international rules-based order. And that order says many things, but above all, it says that you cannot enter another country by force and take what is not yours. Now, there is a coalition in the world at the moment, and I would almost say that the dominant partner in that coalition is not Russia, it is China. And China is still sitting back, and it is weighing up its options, whether to go in fully on the side of Russia or not.
This is very Chinese way, isn't it? It's very Chinese way.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. If we study our history, and I do, we know that China will only do what is in China's interest. But we have a rules-based international order, which, though it may be imperfect, has given us, since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, has given us the greatest period of peace and prosperity and security that the Western world has ever known. Now, Russia, Putin, and his cronies have made it very, very clear for almost 10 years now in their pronouncements that they hate this rules-based order. Sergei Lavrov, if I can just tell a story, in 2017, Sergei Lavrov went to the Munich Security Conference, and he talked about the breakup of the rules-based order, and he celebrated it, and he talked about the rise of what he called the post-West era. Now, I would ask people in the West in particular to consider what that post-West era would look like, an era or an order which would be led by Russia, by China. We know that in Russia's pocket already there is North Korea, there is Syria, there is Iran, there is Belarus. We know that there are many other countries in the south, in Brazil. India is not absolutely solid on the side of democracy, I believe, but many, many countries on the African continent, where Russia works very, very hard to gain influence, and the criminal Wagner organization is operating in many of these countries, sowing dissent and chaos. So really, even if we don't care, as you and I do, Henry, about the Ukrainian people, and if we do not believe that it matters that a nation of 45 million people should not be subjected to genocide, even if we don't care about that, we must realize that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, the whole order that we have come to take for granted for the last nearly 80 years is under severe threat.
Thank you very much, dear sir, for your detailed answer. Let us return to my questions, and we will talk about that later on a bit, because I have a lot to add to it. The construction of a new Kakhovka HPP, or the complete repair of this HPP, will take place after the situation on the front stabilizes, after Ukraine defeats the enemy, said Alexei Kuleba, deputy head of the office of the president of Ukraine, in a comment to Radio Liberty. We understand it is necessary to put as much pressure on Moscow as possible in order to do many things, make them like withdraw their troops from our land, in order to counter their propaganda, etc., etc. Is there a way to create such a pressure using a communication, again, tool, some technology? And is it possible after all?
Well, before, I think at such a stage as the war is won, and that is, we are still a long way off that. There will be many, many hundreds of billions of dollars available for the reconstruction of Ukraine, not just for the dam, but for the dam in particular, because we can talk about this has a huge effect on the Ukrainian economy. It has been estimated that the destruction of this dam will reduce Ukrainian wheat and grain production by up to 10% in the coming years. It will, possibly it could turn the Crimean Peninsula, which Ukraine is determined to take back because Crimea is part of Ukraine. It has the potential to turn Crimea into a desert. So there is so much. So to get back to your question, first the war must be won. To win the war, that starts with the diplomatic efforts, but also the communication at every level, using television, using radio, using social media, using anywhere we can influence decision makers. But what I must say is, as much support as the West is giving, it is too little, and it is tending to come too late. We have finally, after 16 months this year, started to give Ukraine all of the heavy weapons that they have been crying out for from the start of this war. This is long-range artillery. We saw Britain give Storm Shadow, which is very important. Right. The battle tanks. We finally saw the Germans agree to release the Leopard tanks, which Ukraine has been asking for. And again, I have got to say, Great Britain has played a huge role in unlocking that logjam with the donation earlier this year, initially of 14 of our Challenger tanks. And the Americans are also giving a small number, I think about 31 Abrams tanks. But this is all coming too late. Only 2 weeks ago, President Biden finally agreed that F-16 modern fighter jets could be given to Ukraine. This will still take some time for those fighter jets to get into the hands of Ukrainian pilots, and for Ukrainian pilots and ground crews to be trained not just to fly these very complex jets, but to maintain them as well. Absolutely. I have got to say that all of these things should have been done earlier, but it is better late than never. So the first imperative is that Ukraine must be helped to win this war and drive Russia off Ukrainian land, because until that happens, and until there are real security guarantees for Ukraine, the reconstruction cannot happen.
I just love the way you answer my questions, dear Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
The International Criminal Court began an investigation into the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant by the Russians, said Volodymyr Zelensky. Earlier, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine also appealed to the G7 and the European Union countries, urging them to consider introducing new sanctions against the Russian Federation, including imposing sanctions on Russia's rocket and nuclear industries. Do you think there will be more sanctions, and what they would look like? What would you say? More sanctions needed?
Well, yes. And look, Henry, I am not going to be fantastic on the detail, but I think, myself and Oleksiy Mikheyev is a very good friend of mine. He is Ukraine's ambassador in Berlin at the moment. And myself and Oleksiy work very closely together, and we keep in very close contact. And we were saying, right from the start, we were saying two things. We must arm Ukraine to the teeth, and we must sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. We still have not, as I have just said, armed Ukraine to the teeth, given them all of the weapons that they need. We are getting there. But certainly on sanctions, I feel that the West is still not going far enough. We see now that the Russian economy, because they have found other markets for their oil.
They're circumventing the sanctions. I'm sorry.
They are circumventing the sanctions, and we believe that China or whoever is supplying them with the vital chips that they need for the guidance systems of their rockets that they are using against civilian targets. There is too much circumvention.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. But are the sanctions working properly?
Well, I don't believe they are.
Exactly. Well, then my next question is, honestly, if that would be up to you, what would you propose as a matter of fact, the sanctions are not really working, not the way they should, like bringing Russia back to Stone Age, as you propose, which I agree to. But what should we do then? As an international society, not just Ukraine. We just have to be resilient and win the war. I understand that.
Right.
But as an international society that gives so much support and effort, finally, what's the next step? Because we're talking about that the 11th package of sanctions will be accepted. So what's to add on top of it? So to put the pressure on Moscow, really, right now, not only after the war is won by Ukraine, but right now, here and now. What would you suggest?
Well, look, Henry, let me have a go at this. I am not a sanctions expert. However, let me make a couple of suggestions.
Yes, please do.
From the start, Ukraine was calling on Russia to be taken out of the SWIFT international money transfer system. I do not believe that has been done completely. This is something which would hurt Russia very badly. Something else I believe, and this is my personal view, I believe there should be an absolute travel ban on all Russian citizens. They should not be allowed outside of the Russian Federation. Certainly there are countries in Africa and allies of Russia who will not apply those sanctions. But I think we need to find a way to bring this pain home to the Russian people, because in all polls we have seen that the vast majority of the Russian people continue to support Putin's regime.
All right, that's right.
And
You're right.
continue to support the war.
Okay, the vast majority, absolutely.
The Russian people, this must be brought home to the Russian people.
What about those people?
This war must be brought home to them.
And what about those people that are against the war? What do we do with them? I mean, you're trying to turn the whole nation into the weapon against Putin's regime. I understand that. And myself, being here in Kiev, I agree with that to some extent. But there is a huge number of people in Russia that are against the war.
Is there a huge number of people that are against the war?
I believe it is.
Where I would ask you is the evidence for this. Now, I grant that it is very, very difficult to protest within Russia. But if we look at the evidence of Russian communities around Europe, we do not see any great groundswell of opposition and protest from those Russians living outside of Russia against the war. I have no doubt that there are good Russians. But unfortunately, when all of the evidence that we have shows that the overwhelming majority of the Russian people are supporting this war, then, Russia is waging a war on the Ukrainian people, not just on the Ukrainian government. And it is, wars are won not by armies, they're won by the people that the armies come out of. And that is the reason, one, that Ukraine is doing so well, but we must do more to undermine the support of Russia's criminal regime from the Russian people. And if you know there are a small number of, or whatever that number may be, but as I say, all of the statistics I have seen suggests that the majority of Russians support the regime. So in the long run, it is unfortunate for those people, but in the long run, if Russia is defeated and the Russian people are made realize that this pain is being brought to them by their government, it is only the Russian people can bring down Putin. And it's been said many times, what Putin fears most is his own people. So it is, there is a huge onus on the Russian people not to support this and to bring its own government to account.
Well, Russia has friends, abroad. And going back to that media thing, some prominent media, as you mentioned, the BBC in a late Saturday show, or what was it, saying that regarding this Kakhovka Dam, this is a catastrophe, a tragedy. And the international media is using this saying, like the Ukraine and Russia parties blame each other, and this casts a shadow onto Ukraine. How to deal with that? What is the proper way to communicate with the world's media to deliver a message to them that it is, maybe we have to change the rules. Maybe some new rules of media should apply in times of war to these guys and to these ladies and gentlemen that really blame us, Ukraine, of blowing the Kakhovka Dam. How should we be acting these days in terms of that?
Right. Henry, let me say two things. One is we have a saying in Britain, and maybe we do need to change the rules of how our media in the West behaves, because to an extent, Russia is using our own values of democracy and balance and fairness against us. If Russia tells me it is raining and Ukraine tells me the sun is shining, and I am a journalist, it is not my job to get a representative of the Russian Federation into the studio alongside a representative of the Ukrainian government to debate whether it is raining or not. It's my job to open the window and stick my head outside and see whether it is raining or whether the sun is shining. I believe, and I have never been a journalist, but I have worked closely with the media for 30 years. I have huge respect for the media. I have huge respect for the BBC. I have huge respect for Jeremy Bowen, who I spoke about earlier, but I was very disappointed with the position which he took just a week ago. I believe the job in a democracy of a journalist is to shine a light into dark corners and to go after the truth. We do not always find the truth by doing what I call both sides. I won't use the word because it's rude, but both sides rubbish. We can't do both sides. We have got to look at the balance of evidence and probability and help the public. The media should be helping the broader public to understand what the truth is, not giving 50% to both sides of the argument and letting people make their own mind up.
Help me to understand why is this happening? why the like very prominent and names in the media industry say these things. Is that coincidence, or is it a position that Jeremy Bowden just took, and that's we're trying to look unbiased, or what?
Let me propose to you my theory. And my theory revolves around hybrid warfare. In particular, it revolves around the Russian model of hybrid warfare. And a key, hybrid warfare is using a whole range of different tactics, ranging from, at one end of the spectrum, conventional violence, which is what Russia has been doing since what Russia has been doing in Ukraine since 2014 with the invasion of Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea. But that escalated massively on the 24th of February 2022. But hybrid warfare also involves interference in elections. It involves cyber attacks. It involves doing various things to sow confusion and dissent. But above all, in the Russian model, it involves disinformation. What I referred to earlier as lying. Russia is a country that lies on an industrial scale. And they have been doing this in particular since 2005, when the channel Russia Today, now known as RT, was launched and set up offices around the Western world. And what RT says is question more. And that tells us exactly what their tactic is, because what they want us to question in the West is our own norms. Exactly as Jeremy Bowen said last week, well, we may never definitively know who did it. We have to question more. It could have been Russia, it could have been Ukraine. The dam might just have fallen apart. And the point I'm trying to come to, Henry, is people in the West need to better understand the nature of hybrid warfare. They need to understand that a weapon in this war, which, by the way, is not just waged on Ukraine, it's waged on all of us in the West, and you in particular, being from Latvia. When I was last out in Latvia and when I was in Lithuania, and this was back in 2015 to 2018, so many people told me how much fear they had of Russia and how actually they weren't completely confident that if Russia did invade, that NATO would act on Article 5. I think there is maybe a little bit more confidence around that now. But people need to understand the nature of hybrid warfare, the nature of Russian disinformation, the massive amount of resource which Russia puts into this. Starting at the top, it's led by their diplomatic missions, their embassies around the world, including the UN. Their ambassadors lie every day. Sergei Lavrov lies every day, down to channels like Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik, which are not real media organizations. They are lying channels for the Kremlin. Down to they have well-placed assets in different countries. You know some of the people I'm talking about and what I'm talking about, who constantly push the Russian line. And there are armies, as you know, in troll farms outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, who drip their poison and their lies across the internet every day. They are paid to do it. They are professional trolls. And behind them is a whole, if you like, volunteer army of useful idiots, we call them, who for whatever reason, for stupidity or corruption, corrupt minds,
absolutely,
like to believe in Russia, like to support Russia, and like to help amplify the Russian story. So we need to answer your question, we need to better understand the nature of hybrid warfare, and that this war we are in at the moment has been, more than any war in history, is an information war as well. And if the Western media can understand that, they must understand that the way that we want to do things in peacetime, in democracy, where we have balance and fairness, simply cannot pertain when we're dealing with Russia, because what Russia has been doing for many, many years is using our own democratic values against us, and we keep falling for it.
Cormac, we in Baltic states, in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, know absolutely well we've paid an enormous price being in Soviet regime. We know that Putin is still there. Russia is the Soviet Union, and we don't want to go back.
Henry, can I say two things? I started to realize this in late 2016, early 2017, when I was working at the heart of the Ukrainian government. And somebody who has gone on to become a very good friend of mine. He is chargé d'affaires in a big embassy in Europe at the moment, and I visited him about a month ago. And he told me one night, he said, Cormac, what you have got to realize, it's not just that we want to be a member of the EU and we want the wealth of the West. It's far more important to understand what we are trying to get away from, the horrors of the Soviet Union that we are trying to leave behind. And I started saying around 2017 to colleagues in the West, and when I did interviews or whatever, we need to see Russia through Ukrainian eyes and through the eyes of people in the Baltics like yourself and the eyes of people in Poland. Because when I speak to people like you, and when I speak to a chap who's a Polish chap who's lived in the UK for 20 years, and I meet him in the park when we walk our dogs, and we talk about this. And when I talk to people like this, they grew up with the horrors of the Soviet Union and the stories of their parents and their grandparents who, so many people have told me that people who lived through the Second World War would say how much worse the Russians were than the Nazis ever were. We need to, but we don't see that in the West. We still see this through rose-tinted spectacles. We need to see Russia through your eyes, through Ukrainian eyes.
Thank you very much.
Through the eyes of people in what I call the Eastern neighborhood, a part of the world that I have fallen in love with, not just Ukraine. I have worked in maybe 12 or 13 different Eastern European countries.
Let me ask you a very straightforward and last question, because this has been a lovely conversation, as I have told you and my dear audience. But we're really running out of time. But my last question is really, really straightforward. Who do you think will win in this war?
My heart says Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
I absolutely back Ukraine. I will not. I have many concerns. I believe Ukraine will win. Because I believe first and foremost in the strength and the decency of the Ukrainian people. And secondly, I have got to believe in the ultimate decency and the belief in freedom and democracy of the Western society that I am part of, and that we will. And we have seen the support grow and grow. And yes, there's huge concerns that how long will that last? But if I'm a betting man, my money is on Ukraine.
Thank you very
but
much.
Not only
Thank
Ukraine
you very much.
must win.
All right. It has been a lovely conversation and a beautiful interview. I hope to see you soon very much. Thank you.
Was that okay, Henry?
Thank you for your time, and thank you so very much, Mr. Smith. Thank you for your time and effort.
I think that's the longest interview I've ever done.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, well, we're still on air, dear sir. We're still on air, but I mean, it's
You're
lovely.
Still on air.
Yeah, it's
still on air. Well, look, if I could just say, Henry, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to join you, and it's been a privilege to have the opportunity to address your viewers. I'm just an Irish guy who lives in Britain, who's worked for the British and the Ukrainian government, who's fallen in love with Ukraine. I have many friends there, and this is a cause that I believe in. Ukraine must win, and we must make sure that Ukraine wins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. See you soon.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Smith. Thank you for your time and effort and expertise. I'll remind you that we had this interesting conversation with Mr. Cormac Smith, the expert indeed in the fields of government communications. Now, that will be all, folks. Thank you for your time, for being with us. I'm Henry Keane, and it was my show Talk for More, with all free world directly from Ukraine. Join the gaze online and feed your thirst for truth and adventure into the breathtaking realm of international news and politics. Take care. See you soon.